Well, I was going to say, you wouldn't read about it, perhaps you would. There are 4 screws that hold this casting to the piece behind it. What was happening was the screw at this point was running right through the casting and rubbing on the gear at the back. So, how much difference was there in length in the screws? Very little. I would have said about 0.5 millimetre. One of the screws was slightly shorter than its mates, and it needed to be in this corner. And once that was sorted out, everything worked entirely normally. So my next task is to reconnect the bellows, which are not connected to the back of the front standard at the moment. Just put the 4 screws back in there and put the chrome trim and the depth of field scale back on the shutter assembly at the front here, and then fit the rangefinder and then check the focus and make sure that the adjust the rangefinder to suit. But first, get these screws in the back here to hold the bellows in place. There are 4 screws. Round heads. I'll get them in place. Once I've got the 4 in place, then I'll tighten the screws up. They're awkward. You're sort of working around the corner to do these screws up because you can't get a good line of sight on them with your screwdriver. But I've just got to get them started. From memory, these screws were stiff to get out to start off with. They've probably been painted in place. That would be a fairly normal practice. It just means that they're then, if any paint runs down into the threads, it's that much more difficult to get the screws in or out afterwards. That's all of them started. I should be able to reach down in there with a longer screwdriver now at a better angle and check that those screws are going correctly. That's good. That's good. So the bellows are all connected back up. Front opens and closes smoothly. And so the depth of field scale and the chrome trim on the front here can now go in place. And that sits on there like that. See if I can wriggle this into position. Well, don't say I've got to put this on before the shutter, that would be no fun. That might be the case. Okay. Alright, I can do that. Take the shutter back off, put that trim in place. Of course, I've got to connect that rangefinder lever up too, don't I? I've forgotten about that. Okay, so the depth of field scale sits on there like that. This piece sits on there like that. That's it. Easy when you know how. 4 chrome screws, 1 at each corner. I'll have to make more effort to find my good tweezers. I hate using second best tweezers. That looks pretty. Put the shutter back in place. Check that I've got that lined up correctly, I suppose would be a useful thing. That's better. And the retainer ring. That seems good. I'll just nip that up tight. Oops, get back in there, shutter release. That action all seems to work nicely. Now my rangefinder coupling. Got to bring out my focus. This rangefinder coupling, what I've done is I've brought my focus scale up to the close focus distance, which it opens up the hole in the front here so I can see it. And somewhere here I'll have my coupling arm that couples to the rangefinder. There it is. And I can put the screw through that point. I'm holding the arm forward with my other finger on the top of the camera body. I'm holding the arm there forward to bring the arm forward at this point. Because my magnetised screwdriver is busy doing its best to make life awkward for me. Back where we started. To this lever here. Just swinging that forward. I've got to get the arm, of course, over the top of the other thing. That's better. And deal with my magnetised bloody screwdriver. Only need 3 hands. There we are. Do that screw up. Now it's fixed. So when I move the focus ring at the front of the camera, you'll see that the arm here moves. This operates our rangefinder, which goes on the top of the body. And in practice, the rangefinder is the next thing we've really got to deal with. One of the arms here on the shutter release mechanism is bent up at a funny angle. Now I don't know whether it was intentionally bent up like that or whether it's been damaged in some fashion. So I'm watching closely to see how that action works to make sure that that's okay. Now that action releases the film advance there, which would allow you to wind on again slightly before the time the shutter is fired. So that tells me that that bent arm is probably bent too high. I'm watching the mechanism and I'm watching the point at which this releases the film advance mechanism here compared to the shutter. So very much at the same point. That's good. I'm just going to put a touch of molybdenum on the tip of this piece here because I'm not convinced that that moves across there quite as promptly as I'd like. It should almost be a bistable. It should be in one position or the other with minimum of fuss, and that seems a bit better. Things like the shutter release, the interlock, is often prone to damage on cameras. As the camera ages and as things become sticky and don't move as smoothly or as promptly as they're supposed to, people will push on buttons that they believe should move. And if it doesn't move, they don't investigate further often, they'll just push harder. And that's when stuff gets damaged. Now why is that? Oh, that shutter release there, that's popping up, that's why that's sticking. It's because the shutter release is popping right out of the body because there's nothing holding it down. I was trying to figure out why that was sometimes sticking at the end of the stroke, but it doesn't indicate a fault. It just indicates that the shutter release is normally kept in position because it's got a top on there which stops it rising up beyond that point. Well, that's good. I'm quite pleased with that. I'm looking at the top cover. See if there's anything I need to know about the top cover. That all looks pretty straightforward, that thing. Can we pop that in place? I'm holding that just in place with my finger. Yeah, the film advance mechanism is certainly happier when the shutter release is held in its normal position, not being allowed to flop up out of the way. That feels very good. Very pleased with the state of that. Pop these screws and rewind button to one side. I'm just having a look at my top cover. The shutter release there seems quite stiff. It is. The shutter release is quite stiff and I can see it sort of gummed up with, you guessed it, dried up old grease. So I'll see if I can clean that. Yeah, it should just flop up and down in the housing here, because there's nothing to stop that. It's hard to get to the back face of that. It will not rotate to allow me to get round the back there with that cotton bud easily because of the shape of it. It seems better. Put a bit of solvent on that and work it a bit. I'll put a wipe of molybdenum on here. That's better. That's flopping up and down now, which it wouldn't do before. It would just stick. See, that'll fall happily now under the influence of gravity. Well, certainly that wasn't doing anything useful for it before. This little tab at the back here, that just keeps dust and dirt from getting down around the slot, around the film advance lever. And apart from that, we've only got the windows to clean in the top housing here. There's nothing else of note there. That fixing screw in the top cover goes through a little bracket here. Have to make sure we don't displace that when I put that back. Will this lift off? Or is it fixed in place? Now it's riveted in place, so I can't dismantle the film speed reminder dial, which I'd otherwise like to. It's fixed with a rivet. That's not the end of the world. It does turn. It's just like most things with an old camera like this. You'd like to be able to dismantle them completely to be absolutely sure that everything is as clean as you can possibly get it. Sometimes you just can't. Not without heroic measures like making new rivets. That seems good. What stage am I at? The top cover is pretty much clean. I'm going to clean the glass in the top cover. Let's wipe some molybdenum paste around that shutter button. That's better. Pop that on the camera body. That certainly has improved the feel of the shutter release. That's good. So the glass in the top cover for our windows for the rangefinder, two at the front, one at the back, need to be cleaned. So with some normal domestic glass cleaner on a cotton bud, I'm cleaning the outside of the windows first. Now that glass sort of slops around in there, which isn't helpful. That's the outside cleaned. The inside. That looks good. And the eyepiece glass here, you didn't see any of that. I was cleaning the inside of this piece. And the eyepiece, of course, needs to be clean. Now normally these are going to be dirtier on the outside because that's where all the dirty oily thumbprints are, but sometimes you'll find that they're actually dirtier on the inside because the camera's old enough that enough oil is evaporated on the inside of the camera and settled on glass surfaces enough to make things pretty opaque. Well, that looks good from the outside. Of course I can see nothing through it because there's no direct line of sight from the eyepiece to the front of the camera. The images diverge either way from there. So the rangefinder, I need to look at the rangefinder. Here it is. Now the rangefinder is operated from the camera. It pushes on this little lever here and slides that left and returns to the, probably that's the infinity position at this end normally, and this would be the close-up position. Now this is very sticky. You can probably see that doesn't really return under its own steam very well. So that means I've got to take that apart. Alright, so just about into new territory here again. Let's have a look at this. First thing I want to do is take this cover off, this black mask. That's the left one. And the right one I want to take off too. That's the right one. That exposes this mechanism. Now this lens here is the moving lens. Here's the spring that returns it to the rest position. And it runs under two posts at this point and this point, and it's quite gummy. So I'm going to take out this screw and that screw and clean everything. Optically, I have to say this looks quite clean, but obviously things are quite gummy. So underneath that screw there's a little spring. And at the other end I expect there's the same. Does this lens just lift off? It does. Alright, that's good. So I'm cleaning this surface that it slides on at both ends. And I'm just seeing traces of grease on that, nothing particularly dramatic. I'll clean the arm itself that slides on those surfaces. Again, I'm not seeing anything dramatic there. There's obviously some grease on there. And I'm looking to see if there are any other points of contact other than at the ends, that it's not rubbing on the frame at all, and it doesn't appear to be. So I'll pop that back on there now, hook its return spring in place. I'm checking the action of that. That seems to move smoothly. I don't see a problem with that. So these little brackets, these little hold down things, like a spring. Perhaps there's too much friction at that point. they're shiny. The screws, they're a shouldered screw, so the screw runs in the slots at each end of this lens. That looks okay. So I'm just going to reassemble this dry without any lubricant and see how it behaves. If it moves quite smoothly, I'll know I've got it clean enough, then I'll disassemble it. I'll put a smear of molybdenum paste on the contact points. And leave it at that. Of course, I've got to check, make sure that optically it's clear enough. It looks pretty good. It may be someone's had it apart in comparatively recent times and cleaned the glass, although not necessarily anything else. Right, let's have a look. Alright, that made all the difference in the world. You see how snappy that is now in its action? So I know that that's all it was. It was just a tiny bit of sticky dried grease. So slight that, you know, it hardly discoloured a cotton bud. Was causing that to be sticky, and that would have meant that the rangefinder would be reluctant to return to the infinity position. Well, that's good. Now I just want to clean these glass surfaces, make sure they're all clean, and check this rangefinder.